Welcome to the last session of the Betty Sinclair Winter School. We have two speakers this morning for you. We have Steve here, I'll introduce in a minute for the main event, and then just to finish off and give us some closing remarks at the end, Brendan Lowe will be nice and say a few words, and then and only then will we let you off the island. Alright? We're free to go. We're very pleased to have Steve with us for this school. Professor Steve King, head of the Department of Economics, History and Politics at Kingston in London. We're pleased to have him here because we've been using Steve in his material and his articles and his blog for the last couple of years. And there are people who know him, follow him in towns and villages across the length and breadth of Ireland now. Last year we were teaching, purely for financial reasons, we were teaching a group of business advisors in Belfast, which isn't our usual kind of gig, And we were quoting Steve, and we were bursting the myth that the last crisis was unpredictable and therefore unpredicted. No one saw it coming. We saw, well, actually, an awful lot of people did see it coming. And the same people that saw the last one coming are now predicting the next one. One of the business advisors was indignant with rage and tweeted Steve. Another big angry letters. I was on a course today, and this person, said that there's going to be another crisis, another credit crunch in the next 5 to 6 years. Fair play to Steve. Steve's tweeted back, and the bloke, is this true? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Mm-hmm. And he tweeted back, yes. So, I'll hand over the very around to Steve.
Okay, fine. Well, I didn't actually know what sort of audience I was going to have because I get a ridiculous number of invitations to speak, and I sort of tick this one off and say I'll turn up. And I've actually been in Frankfurt talking to what's called the European Banking Congress. And the two speakers, one of the speaker before me was one of the board members of the ECB, European Central Bank, and the first speaker, the next one I went to the next day, but I wasn't a speaker, but I was in the audience, was Mario Draghi. So I've just come straight from that, and I got an idea of what this is all about in the taxi ride pretty much here, and talking to Steve this morning. And funnily enough, this is partly what you're doing is part of my history, because I was part of what's called the Business Union Consultation Unit back in Australia when we had what's called the Labor Party Accord, the Business Union Accord, trying to manage the economy in a sort of collegial way. And as part of that, we formed what's called the Business Union Consultation Unit, which has the nice little acronym of BUCU. And we used to organise seminars bringing together trade unionists and manufacturers and so on in a totally isolated location called the Clyde Cameron College in Albury-Wodonga. You've all heard of Albury-Wodonga, haven't you? Okay. It's 550 kilometres from Sydney and about 250 from Melbourne. We're talking not only before internet, we're talking pre-mobile phones. So you shove a bunch of trade unionists in that particular location. They can't talk to anybody in the committee. They can't have a fight. Well, they can fight with each other, but they can't do anything other than just focus on what we're talking about. So it was a brilliant resource, and finally died the way often these things often do. And I went off and did my PhD at university because I felt the reason the trade union movement and the left has been comprehensively defeated in the last 30 or 40 years is they don't have an alternative analysis of capitalism. What they end up with is saying that we're going to do what the mainstream does but not enjoy it as much as the mainstream does. Okay, so we're going to deregulate this and privatise that, but we're going to be sorry about it rather than bragging about it. That really is fundamentally about as far as it goes. And so all we're going to do is try to fix up the things which are wrong with the market system, taking the concepts from the conventional thought that the market system works perfectly in the absence of various distortions, such as, for example, trade unions. Okay, so in that sense there was a existential crisis in how the left approached what they thought was being progressive in a modern economy, because they're accepting an analysis of capitalism which argued it worked best if there were no trade unions and no monopolies, but it's much easier to abolish trade unions than monopolies, so let's work on those first, etc., etc. So I saw the left as basically cutting its own feet off. It had no alternative. The only alternative it really had was what I call cardboard cutout Marxism. Now, apologies to anybody who would still call themselves a Marxist. I do too, but I reject the labour theory of value. I think that particular error in Marx's logic is something that I've often said that if a 19th century Machiavellian capitalist wanted to completely derail the revolutionary movement, he could do nothing better than to invent the labour theory of value, because it gave you an intellectual puzzle that couldn't be solved, that diverted the intellectual energies of people who are trying to change society into trying to solve an intellectual problem with no solution. and consequently you look at what happened now in the crisis we've just been through. Understanding that being a believer in that theory did not equip you to handle knowing how this crisis came about. You have to look at the nuances of Marx, the stuff that was outside that core, to actually understand the crisis. So that's what I've been doing myself. I've read everything Marx has ever written in economics from 1844 through to 1894, the publication of the third volume of Capital. And there is much more to Marx than the labour theory of value. In fact, he overturns it, in my opinion. My first academic work is to argue that Marx's philosophy contradicts the labour theory of value. Well, that's a long prelude to saying that we need a completely alternative analysis of capitalism, what the mainstream does. And that alternative is feasible these days if it's part of it, abandoning that particular fixation. And what I see as being the way of analysing capitalism now that gives us a completely different vision of how it functions, and a realistic one, comes out of what's called complex systems theory. So have you heard of that particular term? Anybody in the room? Some? Okay. And I find that what I'm going to be giving you partly today, I'm jumping around a whole range of different presentations. Now that I know what the audience is, I'll be better prepared when I do come back next year, because I will come back, I think, if I'm invited. I may not, you never know. What I'm going to start with today is the presentation I'm giving tomorrow to the Bank of England, at its invitation. The one thing I have to say strongly in favour of the Bank of England over any other central bank in the world from the OECD side of things. The non-OECD banks are a lot more open. But the Bank of England is open to alternative thinking about the economy. That's really a strong positive in their favour. The Federal Reserve has locked down even more than it did before the crisis in defending conventional thought about the economy. The ECB is a wasteland. I'm talking about having experienced Mario Draghi yesterday. They had a theory of how capitalism functions that completely fell apart in 2008. And if you think about this whole left-right battle we've been through in the last 40 or so years, the right wiped the floor with the left back in the days of stagflation. Rising inflation along with rising unemployment was said to be inexplicable from a Keynesian point of view. It could be explained by monetarism, which is where Milton Friedman came in. That then gave that was a totally free market-oriented picture of how capitalism should function, which is an inversion of what we had after the Second World War, where there was a strong argument that capitalism had led to the Great Depression, which led to the Second World War. We had to tame the excesses of capitalism to have a sustainable system. That was a philosophy that began the 1940s and the 1950s in most of the West. And 20 years later, it's wiped out by Milton Friedman, back to total free marketism and so on. And then the whole wave of deregulation that went through that, Maggie Thatcher in particular, I don't need to tell you people about it, you experienced it, I just observed it from a distance. Eliminating all the social structures that we built up in those 20 years after the Second World War. And appearing to succeed in a triumphalist way, because the economy changed dramatically in style, but it still grew. And they basically saw themselves as being the stewards of that growth, and it was all through deregulation, getting rid of controls, letting capitalism rip, getting the trade unions out of the way in particular. That was all the philosophy that was behind their belief as to why they succeeded. That had bugger all to do with why they succeeded. The reason they succeeded was the deregulation liberated the financial sector. Let the financial sector lend much more dramatically than it had been able to do before that. It was still causing a rising level of debt, but that freedom to create debt and the promotion of debt really took off in the Thatcherite years. The big bang, of course, the deregulation of the market in London and so on. Reagan's deregulation of the savings and loans, etc., etc. That just pumped out more and more debt into the economy. Now, that actually causes growth. When it first starts happening, when you have a rising level of private debt, that adds to demand and income. And I've been working on an analysis to try to explain all that, and I'll show that to you today. But that growing demand is what enabled the economy to grow that much during that period. Now, I've now reached the point where the level of debt, private debt, and Ireland is a classic example of that, is so great that you were never going to get a particularly large growth of debt again. So the engine that enabled that neoliberal vehicle to take off has now saturated the capacity of society to absorb its waste product, which effectively is debt. And I said I will be jumping around between presentations. So I want to just show you one on that front. This is what I gave 2 days ago, immediately after the central bank speaker. And I'll put a few more. The only thing I've done to make this presentation different is include some charts on Ireland. And I expect you to be fairly gobsmacked when you see what Ireland looks like compared to the other countries I've got in this analysis. But the crisis, of course, as I said, caught the mainstream by surprise. So in that sense, we are at a very important point in intellectual history now, that the right, having been completely ascendant and believing its own bullshit, effectively, they really do believe their theory. It's not a case of ideology. They believe that they understand capitalism and they can't work out why it's not functioning the way they thought it should right now. That confusion was obvious to me when listening to Mario Draghi and also Peter Pratt speak in the last couple of days. So they still hang on to their theory. They still think it's the way to destroy capitalism, and they can't work out why capitalism is not responding to that, what they think will be effective stimuli. But this is a classic statement from Wolfgang Schäuble, whom I also heard speak yesterday. And Schäuble wrote this piece in the New York Times where he started off by saying that as in medicine, to describe the right treatment, it is essential to have the correct diagnosis. And I don't go into what his diagnosis was, which of course was wrong, but his diagnosis was that the whole cause of the crisis was the euro causing all interest rates to fall to the same level, so Ireland could borrow at the same rate as Germany. That then led to a undervaluation of risk in this economy. You were treated as being at the same risk level as Germany, which you weren't. The market then realised it made a mistake and the rates exploded, and therefore that's what caused the crisis. That was all due to the convergence of interest rates, and of course the focus is on government debt here, not private debt. And then to restore the crisis, you've got to get your finances back in order, which means austerity. And once you've done that, you restore trust, and that's the important thing, the economy can grow again. That was his analysis. Let's crack. Because what actually caused the boom before the crisis was the amount of huge growth in the level of private debt. And the crisis itself commenced when the rate of growth of that debt slowed down. Now, that alone is enough to be describing as a heretic, not just in neoclassical mainstream circles, but also to some extent in my own post-Keynesian school, because what I have to argue is that change in debt actually adds to demand. And I've been accused and it's taken me a while to work out the analysis to the stage where I'm completely confident in the case I put forward. But I'll make the argument in the next few points here. That's first of all that the reason that change in debt adds to demand and adds to income simultaneously. First of all, is well stated by the Bank of England in the paper they published in 2014. I highly recommend it. It's called Money Creation in the Modern Economy. Have anybody seen that? Yeah. That could be subtitled The Letter to Paul Krugman, trying to tell Paul, wake up, you're wrong, which he hasn't done, of course. But what they said was they supported the perspective that my particular School of Economics, the post-Keynesian school, has been making for 40 years now, that money is created when a bank creates a loan. So the bank creates a loan, it says, that's a good idea, yeah, we reckon you should buy that house for £500,000. Here's the £500,000 to buy it, and by the way, you owe us £500,000. So they whack £500,000 in your deposit account, which increases the bank's liabilities because your deposit account is a liability of the bank, and they simultaneously add to their own assets by putting £500,000 as a loan they've made to you, and that increase in the assets and increase in the loans creates money. And of course, when you buy the house, you then hand over £500,000 to the person you're buying the house from, which is either an income or a capital gain for the person you're buying the house from. So you get an increase in money, which is an increase in demand, which is an increase in income. They all go together. So that's the basic logic. I can explain it mathematically, and I'll be hitting the bank with that tomorrow, I think. But this is just a basic argument that when you borrow money, when you actually apply for a loan, if you've been through this experience yourself, like with a credit card, you'll get a credit card, and the credit card will say you've got a £3,000 limit. Okay. But you actually, when you first get the credit card, there's zero on it. If you decide to go and splurge out and buy an expensive computer with that card, then you get a £2,000 debt on your credit card, and you're putting £2,000 at the same time in the bank account of the company you're buying the computer off. So they all go together. It's quite simple in that sense. And so that when you spend the debt, you get the right to to the debt by negotiating a contract with a bank, or they force it down your throats these days, as we more often see. I've got so many bloody invitations to take up credit cards since I arrived in this country, it's not funny. When you spend, you increase expenditure, which is your expenditure, and becomes somebody else's income at the same time. And that's not offset by any fall in the spending power of other agents, because the way that the neoclassicals think about this, they have this mythical model they call loanable funds, which says that banks are just intermediaries. They're like an introductions agency. What's that one called? Ashley Madison? Okay. They don't actually screw you, but they find somebody else you can screw and they charge a fee for arranging it. Okay. Because people have since said they have been screwed by Ashley Madison, but that's another story. That's the model that they have of banking. Now, in fact, the model it's not so much Ashley Madison as a model of banking, it's a brothel as a model of banking. Okay. They actually provide the loan. It's not a case that they're just an agency. They are providing the loan, creating it. But the neoclassicals leave it out of their thinking by simply believing that banks just introduce one agent to another. Now, if that actually happened, if you were getting a loan from somebody else who was also a non-bank, they would have to take money out of their deposit account and put it into your deposit account. And by doing that, their spending power falls and your spending power rises, and the two cancel each other out. And therefore you can ignore the aggregate level. That's the thinking that lies behind the mainstream argument. You can ignore the level of private debt. Now, when you say you can't, you put it together properly, then that's actually the major source of demand in the economy. And that's what's left out of conventional thinking. So it also then depends upon just how much debt do you have as to how much impact it has upon your economy. So if you look at Germany, Germany is giving the rest of the world lists and saying, why can't you be like us? Okay? Why can't you behave like we do? If everybody behaved like Germany, the world would be perfect. And here's what we do, so you should do it too. Now, one of the things they do is say, we run a trade surplus of 7.5% of GDP per annum. So why don't you all run a trade surplus of 7.5% of GDP per annum? Reason, it's bloody impossible. That is a zero-sum game, that particular one. But the reason Germany is so well off is they are running a gigantic trade surplus because they're trading with an undervalued currency, and that's therefore meaning they are getting this gigantic surplus mainly from the rest of Europe to them, which means they don't need to borrow money because, in effect, they're outsourcing their money creation to other economies. That's getting a bit ahead of myself here. When you look at their situation, their private debt to GDP ratios has fallen from about 130% of GDP to 110% over the last decade and a half. And the rate of growth of debt is actually quite small as well. It's maximum it's ever grown at is 8% in 1 year, 8% of GDP. And when it slows down, the maximum it's fallen by is minus 2%. Now, I'm using Spain here because that's what I had in my charts yesterday. I can put Ireland's data in there pretty rapidly. But when you have a level of debt like Spain reached, which is 220% of GDP, twice Germany's ratio, then in 1 year that level of debt grew by 35% of GDP. Now that's saying demand in that country economy is 35% larger than its GDP alone that particular year. Then when the slowdown hit, private debt fell by 20% of GDP, which means you've gone from plus 35% above GDP to 20% below in 1 year. Okay? And the same thing happened in a bigger scale to Ireland, as I'll show you in a moment. So that affects both demand for assets and demand for goods and services, because a huge part of this debt is created to finance buying houses. You know, you're all going to get rich selling second-hand houses to each other. Or at least in Ireland, you try to get rich by selling new houses to each other, which has got some sort of chance of working. But that dominates the demand side, except in the country that's lecturing the rest of Europe about what to do, which is Germany, where, because they have far better terms for renters and far better controls on what banks do, and banks are small and regional, Germany actually, on that front, we should try to copy them, because rights for tenants are so good that nobody feels pressure to get out of a rental situation into taking on debt and buying a property somewhere. I've yet to see this, like proof of this, but I've been told that in Germany, when you sign a rental contract, you're required to supply the kitchen because you're expected to be there that long, and you have that degree of rights to change the nature of the place you're in. I mean, in England and in Australia, you've almost got to apply to the landlord to buy a new fork and you can be chucked out with 6 weeks' notice in most cases. So that puts much less pressure on people to borrow money and get into the housing market. So those are really important reasons for Germany being an exception. But when you take a look at the level of private debt, I'm now including Ireland here. This is the ratio of private debt to GDP from 1974 around the world. And when you were calling yourself the Celtic Tigers, you're actually the Celtic borrowers. Okay? Your level of private debt rose from 100% of GDP in 1998 to 330% of GDP by 2011. And while the neoliberals have got you focusing about the level of government debt and seeing that as the problem, that's what you've actually been doing. Now that meant effectively you spent 2.5 times, roughly 2 times, your GDP in borrowed money in addition over that period when the growth was on. And that's why your economy boomed so much. Same sort of thing applies in every other country I'm showing there except Germany. Notice that Germany's data is this one here, trending down all the way. It's the exception. Okay? There you have Spain. That's America, which of course is a far bigger economy than the rest, so its impact was far more dramatic on the rest of the economy. Spain and you're the Irish. Congratulations, you're the world champions borrowers. Now, when you take a look at what that means in terms of rate of growth of debt, then before the crisis hit, in 1 year, the increase in private debt in Ireland was roughly 50% of your GDP. Now, a certain amount of credit growth demand from credit is a necessary part of a well-functioning capitalist economy, which I might add is also an oxymoron. Okay? But credit growth is something you need in a capitalist economy in general. But you don't need 50% in one bloody year. That's what I'm talking about. Neoliberalism worked because of the scale of increased borrowing money that enabled to happen, and that borrowed money not just increases the capacity of the borrower to spend, because the borrower spends that money, it causes a generalised boom in the economy. That's what you've been through for the last 30 or 40 years. Now, I've shown Japan for a very good reason. It's crazy, actually, when I used to show this chart, before I included Japan, I included Spain and Ireland in the chart, then Japan's increase in debt, coming in 25% of GDP in 1 year, was one of the highest that you could find. Now it looks trivial, but Japan did the same mistake we're now doing 18 years before we did it. They had a bubble, they actually called themselves the bubble economy from 1980 to 1990. Actually dates from the 1970s. But their rate of growth of debt was so great that it gave them this huge stimulus on top of their export performance as well, and the innovation they were bringing with all their just-in-time manufacturing systems and so on. But when that rate of growth of debt slowed down, that's when the Japanese crisis began. Now, we've done exactly the same thing. Here's Ireland bouncing around a bit, and part of this also being what the Troika forced onto you as in privatisation terms. But there's the American data, the most significant because it's the largest overall. Plunge in that going from an increase in debt of roughly 15% of GDP in 1 year down to minus 5%. That's what began the global crisis. And in Ireland, you've gone from as high as plus 50 to as low as minus 30. So this is the scale of what you've been through. Now, just to show the impact, the empirical argument that this change in debt is the major factor that drives economic performance in a capitalist economy, this is the correlation of the change in private debt with the level of unemployment in Japan over the last half century. And there's something in the data here. This is data I've got from the Bank of International Settlements just recently, and there's clearly some sort of discontinuity. I think that's just, to me, that's an obvious change in the data series rather than a proper phenomenon. I'll have to go back and check the data properly. So that reduces my correlation coefficient somewhat. It's still minus 0.86. Okay? It just shows how phenomenally important the change in debt is to driving the economy. Looking at America, and this is much better data because America's been collecting this data properly for 50, 60 years now. The correlation over the last 25 years, last quarter of a century, is minus 0.93 between change in private debt and the level of unemployment. It just shows the centrality of this issue to how capitalism actually functions. Spain, even better. Shorter time series because the data series is shorter, minus 0.97. Now the funny thing is, these are correlation coefficients that would conventional economists would salivate to get anything even roughly approaching this in a highly sophisticated model. They put together numerous parameters and numerous interactions and so on. I get it with one variable. And yet at the same time I can't get the conventional economists to even look at this because it fits outside their mindset, which says that the level of private debt has no impact upon the economy. I'll quote Ben Bernanke here. When Ben Bernanke got the job as being Federal Reserve President on the basis that he was the expert on the Great Depression. He is not the expert on the Great Depression. He's the expert on explanations of the Great Depression that are consistent with neoclassical theory. So you likely got a detective trying to solve a murder mystery who believes that it can't possibly be suicide. So you find the lord of the manor dead. What's the solution? The butler did it. The butler in this case being the Federal Reserve. He blamed the Federal Reserve for causing the crisis. That's the only way he can explain the Great Depression without blaming capitalism itself for its own problems. But they ignore all this stuff. They won't even see the data. It's quite remarkable. This is Ireland's situation. You've got a lower correlation coefficient, I think largely because a large part of your performance has come out of all the cutting your tax rates and attracting transnationals here. And that's why you've also got out of the crisis so rapidly as well, which Greece can't do because you've dramatically changed your competitiveness by cutting back wages and everything, conditions over here. But it's still a reasonable correlation to show that impact on your economy. Germany, on the other hand, which is advising us all how to behave, the correlation is still there, but it's trivial, minus 0.2. The reason being their huge trade surplus is what's actually providing the large part of their money supply. They don't need to, they can run a government surplus rather than a deficit, which a functioning economy should run, and they can reducing their private debt level while still increasing their money supply because their trade surplus is 7.5% of GDP. But they then lecture us on why can't you be like Germany, and the answer is because you're doing something that if we all did it, you would have no trade surplus. Okay? That's why it can't be done. So that's an overall perspective on the statistical side. What I want to talk about now is also the need to change how we think about how capitalism functions, because we've been dominated by the neoclassicals who talk about competition, efficiency, etc., and the behaviour of agents. Economics has become even weirder in the last 40 years than it was 40 years ago when Milton Friedman came in with monetarism. Has anybody done an economics degree in recent years? Yeah, okay. How recent?
It's actually not recent.
Yeah. So if you do it these days, they learn right from the outset they're trying to derive their entire analysis of capitalism from the behaviour of a single agent. They have a single agent they call a representative agent. And this representative agent is a representative consumer who tries to maximise their utility over their infinite lifespan. I am not joking. They just presume you live forever, and therefore you try to work out the way to maximise your utility over an infinite time horizon. And to do that, you're making a choice between labour now and leisure now. So if there's a change in the rate of interest, that makes it more expensive for you. I've forgotten whether I can't work this one out in my head straight away, but a change in the rate of interest dramatically changes your consumption. And in fact, I think you're supposed to consume more if the interest rate goes up, according to their theory. I should take a look at it. And this stuff, you have to take some intoxicating substances to be able to survive reading this stuff, but that's what they believe. And so they're all talking about optimising agents on one hand. This representative agent, in the very first version of the model, they call real business cycle model, this agent was a consumer who had to decide how much to either consume now, which requires labour, or not to consume, which requires leisure. So when you decide not to work, when you become unemployed, it's because you decided it's actually the cost of work now, the disutility from work, is greater than the utility you get from labour. Therefore, you decided not to work, which is what explains the Great Depression. If you think I'm joking, I'll show you a paper that says precisely that by one of the Nobel Prize winners who developed these theories. Called some observations on the Great Depression. But that's the consumer side. At the same time, as well as being deciding how much to work, the factory you work in is one you own. Okay? You own the only firm in the economy. which operates under perfect competition, by the way, despite the fact that it's the only firm. Okay? I mean, really, I've never ever experienced magic mushrooms, but I'm sure I can get a fantastic store of them from Harvard. When you see this crap they come up with. But that then has a firm deciding how much to produce based on trying to maximise its profit, again, over an infinite horizon. And they then solve these equations, incredibly complicated process to get to it. What it ends up having you doing, allegedly, is a single agent. There's no class issues, by the way, because you're both a capitalist and a worker. Distribution doesn't matter. Okay? Income inequality can't apply because you're the only person in the economy. Okay? Perfect Gini coefficient. All this sort of nonsense. And what they argue is there's a bliss point in the future, and it's actually literally called a bliss point from the original paper written back in 1926 by a guy called Ramsey. There's a bliss point which is unstable. Okay? In fact, when you work out the properties of this bliss point, it's unstable. If you were close to it and you moved away and it was a mathematical process, you'd move further away, you wouldn't get closer to it. But they presume you've got what they call rational expectations. Now, by rational, they mean having the capacity to accurately prophesise the future. So how many people here are rational? Nostradamus? Jesus? They must have decided to take a break. Literally, that's the definition of rational. Having a model which lets you predict the future accurately. And they won't say perfectly accurate. They'll talk about not making mistakes overall, on average. So your estimates of the future are actually around the mean of what's going to apply, rather than being point estimates. But that's their logic. So that's the world they live in. Now, it's a delusional world. They were bad enough in the days of Milton Friedman. They're completely delusional now. And then, of course, the crisis comes along, and they had no idea where it came from. And the only explanation they can give is some exogenous shock hit the economy. But the exogenous shock, in this case, came from the financial sector. And it's a surprise to most people to learn that the financial sector is outside the economy. That's what they have to do to explain where the crisis came from. This is the world they live in. So this is one of the leaders of this whole critique that undermined what was seen as Keynesian economics before Milton Friedman came along. This is a subsequent follow-up to Milton Friedman, who argued that the economy is actually, and notice the structure of an econometric model, not the structure of the economy, but they believe their model is the economy. Partly where they go so crazy wrong. The model is the optimal decision rules of economic agents. So what they see as the structure of the economy are the decisions we all make to maximise our utility if we're consumers, or to maximise our profit if we're firms, and they lump them all together. And they therefore say that you have to actually model from the micro level up. So you have to talk about utility maximising consumers to derive effectively your aggregate level demand curve, and profit maximising firms to drive your aggregate level supply curve. And that's how they actually work out a model of the economy. And that's the model they're fiddling with now to try to explain where the crisis came from and why the economy is not responding. And I've sat through some of this stuff not from Draghi so much, but Fred 2 days ago. So what they're arguing is the agent behaviour is the thing you have to model. And that's what their models do. They now call them DSGE models, which stands for Dynamic, Stochastic, General Equilibrium. Now, speaking as somebody with a bit of a training in mathematics, I'd call them SE models, Stochastic Equilibrium models, because they're not dynamic and they're not general. But this vision of how one does the economy dominates their thinking. And because it's incredibly hard to learn this stuff, it's when you actually get the final model, they're trivial. They're linear models. They're unstable linear models, but they still treat them as stable, and they have all sorts of complicated estimation techniques to try to solve them numerically. But it's really, really hard to work its way through the various steps they get to get to the final point where they get a model they can actually simulate. And as a result of that, they don't learn anything outside their neoclassical canon. They have never heard of Keynes. They only hear of Keynes as a swear word. Okay. Marx, forget it. Schumpeter, no, who's he? So there's an incredible level of ignorance, not only about alternative economic theories, but even about their own school of thought and where it came from. So they're really... the American Economic Review had a committee which they made the great mistake of putting good people like David Collender on some years ago. And that committee's conclusion about the state of academic education in America, published by the AER, said it was likely to produce a generation of idiot savants, which is fundamentally what it's done. So those idiot savants were in charge of the economy when the crisis hit, and they're still trying to solve why things went wrong with an idiot savant focused on this bizarre model that they think is the real world. So they have the system driving itself towards equilibrium. We're given this incredible capacity of agents to predict the future, even though the mathematical properties of that equilibrium are unstable. And when you have any divergence from equilibrium, it's because of some external shock, which can't be predicted, therefore they can't be blamed for not seeing the crisis coming. And the deviations of that cycle, of that movement from equilibrium, are due to non-competitive elements in the economy, such as trade unions. One of these days there's going to be no trade unions left, and they're still going to be blaming them for the disequilibrium. But also monopolies are part of it too. And their whole policy role is limited to varying the rate of interest, which is supposed to change the labour-leisure trade-off we make, and that's therefore, if they make the rate of interest low enough, it means that we're not sacrificing any future utility for working harder now, so we work harder now. And therefore there should be an increase in employment. That's the sort of logic they've got going. And when the economy looked like it was heading towards a better place before 2008 hit, they took credit for it. This is Bernanke writing in 2004 saying improved control of inflation has contributed to this welcome change in the economy. So really they were patting themselves on the back for the achievement they thought was due to their policies. And then along came the crisis. So here's an alternative approach that you might recognise. Okay. Men make their own history, pardon Marx for being sexist, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. And that really argues that the structure of the economy is more important than this agent behaviour stuff. And also our behaviour is not something where we can accurately predict the future, but we simply haven't got a clue about the future. And Keynes made a wonderful set of statements about what they would do in that situation. He said, for a start, what we will do, since we can't know the future, but to decide to invest or even decide to buy a house, you have to take a punt what you think is going to happen in the future. So what you do in that situation, you extrapolate what's happening now. If house prices are rising, you expect them to continue rising. Okay? Only a few contrarians like myself shoot themselves in the foot sometimes by thinking otherwise, and sometimes make a fortune by thinking otherwise. But generally speaking, we extrapolate forward what's happening now. We assume that existing prices make sense, and I love this final phrase from Keynes, knowing that our own individual judgment is worthless, we endeavour to fall back on the judgment of the rest of the world, which is perhaps better informed. In other words, we herd. And that's classically what we do. Now, what I've done is say you can use this as a basis for modelling behaviour, not as something which is accurately forecasting the future, but simply extrapolating forward the current conditions. So what I use in the model I'm going to show you about the cops and mathematics, my apologies here, okay, is simply saying that workers react to the rate of employment. So the level of wage demands depends on what the level of employment is at the moment, and capitalists invest depend upon the rate of profit. And I improve the realism by using exponential extrapolation later. But the straight line there, very, very simple, nothing about intelligent foresight or anything of that nature. Those are the behavioural functions I use in the model I'm about to show you. And of course you can get much more complicated than that, but I want to show why complex systems make such a huge difference to how we think about the economy and why it should be the sort of thing that the progressive movement tries to develop in the future and supports the development of. So what I've done is to, first of all, say an essential part of the capitalist system is classes, capitalists and workers, who earn their incomes in fundamentally different ways. So that we've got to include them. The old classical school of Marx, Ricardo, Smith and so on was correct in saying you've got to regard humanities being in capitalist system being divided into social classes where capitalists and workers are the two most important, but they are not the only ones. The third important class is the financial class, or bankers. And money and debt, therefore, that's what the bankers add to the equation. That's an essential part of the economic structure. Now, when I put this model together, I did it for my PhD, and I published the paper in 1995, but I wrote the model back in 1992. And I didn't realise in some ways how remarkable that model was, because it was incredibly simple. It simply had as I'll show you in a moment, can be derived from three absolutely undeniably true statements. But it then generated both the Great Moderation and the Great Recession. So it's saying what we've seen in the economy, this period of apparent declining in volatility before the crisis hit, that combination is actually a complex systems phenomenon, which is called an emergent phenomenon. Have you heard of the concept of emergent phenomena at all? Some of you have, okay. That's the idea that the behaviour of a collection, even of identical elements, cannot be derived from the behaviour of isolated instances of those elements. And this is something which the neoclassicals have completely gone in the opposite direction to science, because complex systems and emergent phenomena has really taken over all the genuine sciences. Economics is not a science. It might be in 200 or 300 years. It certainly isn't now. But where the conventional sciences have gone in the direction of complexity, economics has gone in the opposite direction of trying to completely avoid the implications of complexity. And the hard thing for most people is to get their heads around what does it mean to say a complex system has emergent phenomena. That's one of those phrases, the sort of thing, that's also pass the drugs around when you hear a phrase like that. What the hell's the person mean? Okay. My favourite example of emergent phenomena is one we are currently completely surrounded by. Water. Okay? You had to cross on that ferry to get here. Water you can have pure water, which consists simply of the molecule H2O. Okay. So let's consider a single molecule of water. Is there such a thing as a water molecule? Or an ice molecule? Or a snow molecule? Okay. No. A molecule of water does not have any of those properties. A molecule of water cannot be water. The molecule of H2O is not water. It is not ice. It is not snow. It only becomes one of those in combination with other atoms, with other molecules. So it's the relationship between the water molecules. We call it water. Okay. It's the relationship between the H2O molecules that generates the phenomenon of water by which we're surrounded, that in particular conditions generates snow, that also generates ice that floats on the water, which is not the usual thing for the solid derived from the liquid. Normally the solid sinks to the bottom. The liquid is less dense than the solid. So all these things that we take for granted about water are actually emergent phenomena of water. So it's the easiest and simplest example I can give you that the behaviour of the collective, which is a glass of water, cannot be derived from the properties of a single molecule. In other words, you've got to look at the interrelations between the molecules. So that's what emergent phenomena means. So the emergent phenomenon I'm looking at here is the phenomena of a credit crisis coming out of the interaction between workers, capitalists and bankers, when you take it to the absolutely simplest level. And this is the other intriguing thing about complex systems work. When you look at mathematical models that the neoclassicals use, like for example the Federal Reserve by accident published its model recently. You know a website called Zero Hedge? It has data. The Fight Club movie, or Tyler Durden, what his name is? They leaked it. For some reason, there's an email sent that included as a zip file the entire Federal Reserve model, so you can see what the model is. Hundreds of equations, thousands of parameters. Incredibly complicated, of course, didn't have to give them any warning about the crisis and still won't tell them where the economy is going, and still doesn't include private debt as one of its arguments. But they're incredibly complicated models. And to fit them to the data, they've got to provide shocks where they vary the size of the shocks to make the model fit. It's a bit like having, if you have somebody trying to draw a straight line, or draw a line through a set of curves, and it doesn't work, you come along and fudge the points to make it fit. That sort of thing. That's what they've got to do to make the models fit. They're incredibly complicated models, but they're not complex because the phenomena, they're all additive phenomena. They don't have the interactions to cause the type of effects I'll show you in a moment. But with this incredibly simple model, which has 3 equations to it, 3 variables and 9 parameters, I can generate the phenomena we saw between not just the crisis itself, but the apparent diminution of cycles beforehand. So, anything added in these elements I talked about a moment ago, private debt and interacting systems, what I get is something that actually is now something we now have two data points for. We've now had two giant crises in capitalism, which we have reasonable data, the Great Depression and the one we've just been through. And both of them had this same tendency of declining volatility before the crisis. So this is the unemployment rate and the inflation rate in America from 1920 to 1940. And you can see that the trend for inflation, big slump, which is caused by going back to the gold standard, but then declining inflation over time. So for the 4 years before the crisis hit, most of the time prices were falling. Unemployment also was trending down. That's annual data. It's not as well collected as we have these days. And then you have this explosion in unemployment and massive collapse into deflation where prices were falling as fast as 10% per annum for the 2 years. So prices were falling by 10% per annum. Output was falling by about 15% per annum. That's why it was such a severe slump for America. Looking at the modern data, this is what the neoclassicals saw. And up till this point, they thought that was a proof that they knew how to manage the economy. The peaks in unemployment were falling, and the peaks in inflation were also falling. And they're heading towards this sweet spot of low constant unemployment and low constant inflation. Then without warning, bang, same story, increase in unemployment, sudden deflation. Now they also had, and this is the point I'm talking about initially as well, they also had rising debt followed by deleveraging, which their models ignore because, again, their way of thinking about money says you don't need to include the financial sector. So here's the ratio of private debt to GDP in America. Didn't rise all that much. This is normalised data, by the way, in the sense that I've taken the current definitions the Federal Reserve uses for really well worked out records of American borrowing and then extrapolated them back over previous data which wasn't quite so well defined by the census. So the figures look lower than you'll find published papers in using census data from the 1916 to 1970. But it implies this slow increase in debt, it's still increasing, an explosion there in the ratio while the level of debt was falling. And the reason why the debt to GDP ratio rose, even though people were reducing their debt, of course, was GDP was falling much faster. So you had a period here from 1931 through to 35 where the level of debt was falling. Then a slight recovery when people started to borrow money again and then back to deleveraging again. That phenomenon. What do we face these days? On the left-hand side is the level of debt, by the way. The right-hand side is the change in debt per year. And you can see this cyclical increase in the debt level, rising level of debt throughout, then the crisis hits, we go into deleveraging and back up again. And you'll find the same sort of data. They're not as clean for Ireland and every other country except Germany. So I was attempting to model the potential for a crisis before the crisis occurred. I started doing my model in 1992. And all I wanted to do was to build a model that met Hyman Minsky's definition of a good model. Has anybody here read Minsky? Okay. If you do want to read Minsky, do not read Stabilising an Unstable Economy. That's his most well-known book. It's crap. Minsky wrote a brilliant book called John Maynard Keynes. It was his first book-length treatise where he really got his all the ideas together. That was written in the 1970s, I think. And then he had a whole series of academic papers he wrote over the next 20 years or so, published in a really nice little volume called Can It Happen Again? And that's about 10 quid, I think. It's been reprinted now. It was cost me $100. When I first bought a copy of Can It Happen Again, it cost me, I think, $150. Okay? Hardcover, the only way you can get it. Now you can buy paperback for about 10, 15 quid. Highly recommended because they're short papers, they're pungent, they're well written, and they cover the thesis really, really well. That's the best one to buy. Second best, I suggest John Maynard Keynes. Stabilising an Unstable Economy. It took 15 years to write. Always putting off his publishers. I'm doing exactly the same thing to exactly the same publishers, I've got to confess. But he didn't really have anything new to add in the end. So consequently, Stabilising an Unstable Economy waffles like crazy. It doesn't have the cogency of the John Maynard Keynes or the pithy power of Can It Happen Again? So people who are reading Stabilising an Unstable Economy and trying to model Minsky don't know what they're doing. Okay? Really do read the other two books rather than this one. But Minsky had this brilliant, this is where the title for the book of essays comes from. He said this is his defining question for capitalism. Can it a Great Depression happen again? And if it can happen, why didn't it happen in the years since World War II? He wrote this in 1982. And he said, those are questions which flow from the historical record and the comparative success of the last 35 years. And to answer these questions, it is necessary to have an economic theory which makes Great Depressions one of the possible states in which our type of capitalist economy can find itself. So you've got to have a model which can actually generate a Great Depression. So when I started building this model, that was my intention. I simply wanted to build a model which could generate a crisis, and it had to be a model based on a cyclical economy. You can't use equilibrium as an organising concept for this type of model, because capitalism is not an equilibrium system. It's just nonsense to try to portray it that way. It's 19th century hangover. So get rid of thinking about equilibrium. So I found, on the advice of a brilliant book by an Australian mathematician called John Blatt, he recommended Goodwin's growth cycle model. So I took that as my foundation, and that's a two-equation continuous time model. So this is one thing I better also explain. I led one of the main leaders of a student revolt against the teaching of economics back in Sydney, Australia in 1973. And that led to the formation of the Department of Political Economy as a breakaway from the economics department. But the majority of staff, or virtually almost all the staff, the staff who formed that department, believed that the whole problem was the mathematics. Trying to make economics the mathematical discipline is a big mistake, and we should do verbal and international political economy style thinking. I disagreed with that, because I think that gave neoclassical economists far too much credit. Because a mathematician can reach results they don't expect. For example, the Pythagoreans believed that the square root of 2 is a rational number, because according to their ideology, all numbers were rational, which are the ratio of two integers. The first person to prove that in fact the square root of 5, using pentagons, was an irrational number, was rewarded for his discovery by being drowned in the Mediterranean by his fellow Pythagoreans. But they then later coped with the fact that there were things which were irrational numbers. And then mathematics moved on. Neoclassical economics instead reaches results it doesn't like, and they throw the results in the water rather than the person who found them. And I describe what they do not as mathematics, but mythematics. So if you do mathematics properly, you can actually undermine their approach by developing an alternative position. That's what I've done with this particular model. So it simply had, this model I took had two terms to it, the employment rate and the wages share of output. And I simply added a third dimension at the level of private debt to GDP. And the logic behind that was that I looked at borrowing for only productive reasons. So I ignored Ponzi borrowing, where your households borrow to speculate on rising house prices, and just looked at borrowing by firms to finance investment. And the simple equation I used was the rate of change of private debt is equal to investment minus profits. In other words, if you want to invest and your desire to invest exceeds your level of profit, then you borrow money for the investment. And if your desire to invest is less than your profits, you pay your debt down. Well, that's been empirically confirmed by highly conservative econometricians later. But I didn't know that at the time. I actually did this before they did that empirical research. But I built the model in 82, and it had this unexpected pattern that the bottom two axes, the employment rate and the wages share of output, the vertical axis, strictly speaking, is the banker's share of output, but it's effectively also the debt to GDP ratio. And notice what happens. The system starts down here, seems to spiral in towards what looks like an equilibrium, if you're ignoring the level of private debt, and then rises, and then suddenly cycles become more extreme on the top level. And when I finished writing the paper, that was a total surprise. I had no expectation that was going to come out. That's why I talked about an emergent phenomena. But there's nothing in the model that said you would have diminishing cycles before the breakdown. So I finished with this little rhetorical flourish saying that the dynamics, the chaotic dynamics in the paper should warn us against regarding a period of relative tranquility in the capitalist economy as anything other than a lull before the storm. That's before the great moderation was defined by neoclassical economists. And I thought it was just a rhetorical flourish. Then it happened. So you had what we call a great moderation followed by a great recession. What's actually going on, again, this is a bit of work out of complex systems logic, is that it's not a product of the behaviour of the agents. It comes out of the structure of the model. And this is something which I I can actually build, the way I derive it was different, but I can actually say you can define it by working from a set of identities. So if you define the employment rate, the percentage of population with a job, and say what's the rate of change of that? What's the rate of change of the percentage of people who have a job? Employment rate will rise if economic growth exceeds the sum of growth in labour productivity and population growth. Okay? So the number of people who have a job as a percentage of the total population is going to rise if the economic growth rate exceeds labour productivity and population growth. That's a fact. You can't disagree with it. You can, but you're trying to get a PhD in neoclassical economics. The wage share of output will rise if wage demands exceed labour productivity. There's also a fact. The simple fact I added, the private debt ratio will rise if private debt growth exceeds the rate of economic growth. So there's no way that those three facts alone can tell you what's going to happen. Now, pardon me, here come the equations. So I put that together in a set of equations. I'll bounce through it. I use lambda for the employment rate. Pardon me. Y subscript R for the economic growth rate. The dot above means rate of change of real output. Labour productivity, I'm using alpha, and population growth beta, etc., etc. And I'm going to go through this in more detail, of course, and more slowly with the Bank of England tomorrow. That's the wages share of output. Those are wage demands. And the final one's the debt ratio, and that's the rate of change of private debt. And then I go through what all the equations are. So bang, 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 bang. Okay, nobody blinks? Good. So when I put them in the simplest possible form. So I found all the phenomena we've seen in the last 30 years come out of this model. I get both the Great Moderation and the Great Recession. There's rising private debt. There's also rising inequality. And one, again, remarkable emergent property of this model is that I have no borrowing by the workers in this model whatsoever. Okay? None. But when you solve the model and work out what its distributional tendencies are, capitalist profit bounces around an equilibrium level, and workers' share of output is directly negatively related to the debt ratio. So even though the workers are doing none of the borrowing, they end up paying for it. The capitalists are doing the borrowing. Okay? But workers pay for it by a lower wages share. So there's a direct relationship between the level of private debt and wages, and it's a negative relationship. The higher the level of debt, the lower workers' share of income, period. Now again, I can't explain why. It's like I can't explain why. Well, I could often explain why water is wet. Okay? But it's the same sort of thing. It just is. So I have an incredibly simple model. I say output's just a linear function of the amount of capital you've got. Output's some number times how many factories you've currently got. Investment, a linear function of profit rate. Employment, a linear function of output. And wages, the wage change, again, being a linear reaction by workers to the employment rate. So it's an incredibly simple model with no government sector, no Ponzi behaviour at all. So the bankers have been quite responsible. They're only lending to people who want to build factories. So it's not saying in that sense that it's bad behaviour by bankers. And this is an important point that I haven't elaborated upon here, because Minsky argued his conclusion about capitalism was that it's fundamentally flawed. He said it's prone to booms, panics and crashes. And he said this is due to characteristics capitalism must have, or the financial sector must have, to be consistent with full-blown capitalism. Such a system will be capable of generating signals that generate an accelerating desire to invest and of financing that investment. So it comes down to something you cannot reform away. It's something innate to capitalism. It's an incredibly deep insight. And it turns up in this model. So I simply, again, I'll show you the equations more slowly now, but output being the level of capital divided by capital output ratio. Investment being desired investment minus depreciation, and desired investment just being a function of the rate of profit. And profit being output minus wages minus interest on debt. And then workers' employment being output divided by labour productivity, and wages depending upon the employment rate. A high employment rate means wage rises are positive, a low rate means they're negative, and I finally have change in debt being investment minus profits. If I put that all together, again I'll spend more time with the Bank of England tomorrow, that is a simple model, believe it or not. Okay? It's simple because it only has three variables, which are the employment rate, the wages share of output and the debt ratio, and it's got 9 constants. Now, I mean constants, I mean single numbers that don't vary through the simulation. So there's all the change is coming out of the interaction of those three variables. And what I get out of it is incredibly complex behaviour. And the reason for this is partially that to actually see this behaviour, you've got to have three dimensions in your model. I didn't realise this at the time I built it. I've learned the mathematics out of it. But you need to have three systems interacting with each other to get what we call complex systems behaviour. I think I've got an explanation of that in another presentation, but I'll dash across to that in a moment. Let's see if I can find it here. Okay. Okay. If you have a two-dimensional model, what it amounts to is like having your finger on a table, and you've got to move your finger in such a way you don't intersect where you've been before. So if you try doing that on a table, all you can do is spiral in towards the middle, or spiral out towards the edge of the table, or spiral from one side or the other towards a loop where you continue maintaining. That's the end of the possible dynamical states you can do. If you have a three-dimensional system, then you can get this sort of behaviour. Because imagine now you're told to do the same thing, but now do it in a box. So you've got to move your finger inside a box so you never intersect with the same point. You can go anywhere you like. Okay? The dynamics of the model will determine what actually happens there. But you get incredibly complicated behaviour coming out of it. So that's what I triggered by building this model. And the particular behaviour looks like this. There's employment. This is when I've set it up in such a way that it reaches the equilibrium, because it can either reach the equilibrium or it can have a non-equilibrium outcome. So that's equilibrium. Employment's tapering towards an equilibrium level. Profit rate's doing the same thing. And the thing the neoclassicals ignore is it's all behaving well. The level of debt compared to GDP is tapering towards an equilibrium as well. Put that together in three dimensions. This is the sort of shape you see. Now, that'd be nice, but it ain't capitalism. Okay? So that I can say, yes, this can happen, but looking at the historical record, that's not what happens. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is unstable, and what you get is what looks like a moderation followed by expanding cycles. Now again, there is no exogenous shocks causing those cycles, and there's no changes to parameters. It's an innate phenomenon of the system. This is the profit rate, and one reason why capitalists don't see it coming is their profit rate cycles around an equilibrium as well. Workers are getting less money, but who gives a shit about workers anyway? Pardon me. Nobody got that one. Okay. The conventional modelers don't care about workers getting less because they think that their marginal product must be falling. They ignore it. Okay? So that's why they didn't even see this as an approaching signal. What does happen, they also ignore, is the level of debt appears to slow down rising, but then continues to rise again, and you get a total breakdown. When you graph that in three dimensions, this is what you'll see. Diminishing cycles and then a breakdown. So you've got to see it in this dimensional way to understand what's going on. Now, the actual dynamics were first discovered in fluid. Again, one reason I like water. The fluid dynamics mathematicians worked this out initially because they found periods where there'd be, in their models, diminishing turbulence, a period of laminar, smooth-flowing water, and then turbulence on the other side. And they said what's actually going on is like a dynamic process bouncing between a line and the curve. If the line actually intersect the curve, then it would intersect in two locations, and here you'd get nothing but stable water flow, and above the other intersection you'd have nothing but turbulent flow. But if you have this almost tangency situation, you have turbulence here, it seems to die out, and then you get turbulence on the other side. And that's capitalism in that sense as water. It's got that same sort of behaviour. So when I put the model together, and what I've been doing since then is building ways to model this dynamically, because again we've got to get people away from thinking in equilibrium terms. So this is a software package, one of many. There's about 10 programs in this field, and I'm one of them. I'll finish by showing you a more complicated model, which is more realistic. Sorry about that. He waved at me, so I've got to go through rapidly. Okay. So what I'm doing, and I'll be showing the bank this tomorrow, is that when I bring in the fact that we've got prices in the system, which is all that lot there, okay, I get this model, which is actually quite simple, okay, but I put it together in three dimensions. I'll show you this way. No, I want trade unionists to be able to think this way. I'm pushing my luck, aren't I? But not completely, because what I've got here is saying here's investment minus depreciation, which gives you a capital, gives you a level of net investment, which then gives you the rate of change of capital stock, which if you divide capital stock by capital output ratio, you get output. Divide output by labour productivity, you get employment. Divide employment by population, you get the employment rate. Feed that into your wage change function, you get the level of wages. Multiply that by labour, you get the wage bill. Subtract that from output, you've got net investment, net profit before interest. You then, if the capital rate of profit is high enough to cause capitalists to want to invest and borrow money, they borrow money, which they've got to pay interest on, so you deduct that as well to get your net profit after interest, and that then is what gives you your rate of change of capital stock. Now you simulate this model. I'll slow it down a bit so you can do it slowly. I'll talk through it. And the left-hand graph here is the employment rate. The one next to it is the wages share of output, which you'll see is falling. The inflation rate is down here. And a neoclassical economist looking at that would see diminishing cycles in employment and falling inflation. Great. We've solved the economic problem. What they're ignoring is the debt ratio here, which is rising, as you can see. Continues to rise. Employment appears to have stabilised, but suddenly bigger cycles start coming out. And this to me is like the stagflation period, cycles in inflation and unemployment at the same time. Capitalists think everything is wonderful because it's just bouncing around an equilibrium for them. They can't see any problem because they're paying more to bankers but less to workers, and the two are offsetting each other and they're remaining bouncing around an equilibrium level. But the debt level continues to rise, and at a certain point the reduction in wages going to workers is not enough to upset the compounding effect of the debt. And without warning, you've seen it pass through a period of instability, and you reach equilibrium, which you think is fantastic, and Ben Bernanke takes the credit for it, and then without warning, the level of employment starts to decline. You're in deflation, and you're back in the Great Depression. And you can see this happening now. And still the private capitalists don't know anything's happening because they're still getting the same rate of profit. It's only after this exponential increase in debt gets to be just ridiculous that finally the profit level starts to plunge as well. And the bankers take over everything, and it's good night capitalism. Now, that's the sort of thinking that I want as the foundation for how the trade union movement, progressive people in general, should think about capitalism, because it takes it completely outside the comfort zone of conventional economists, and it actually describes the real world. And that's what we need to do to be able to fight this battle back and win back control of society. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.